When you pull away from someone emotionally, what most people assume is that it immediately creates longing in the other person. But psychologically, it's not that simple. Distance doesn't create emotion on command, it creates space. And in that space, something more important happens: reflection. Because in close emotional dynamics, people don't always see clearly. Familiarity has a way of dulling awareness. When someone is always available, always responding, always present, the mind stops registering their presence as something to evaluate. It becomes part of the background of life, not because they don't matter, but because the human brain adapts to consistency. We stop analyzing what feels stable. So when you suddenly step back, you are not just creating absence, you are interrupting a pattern. And interruption forces awareness. The mind doesn't like gaps, it tries to fill them. It starts replaying conversations, revisiting moments, reevaluating emotions that were previously taken for granted. This is where reflection begins, not because of manipulation, but because of psychological contrast. What was once constant becomes noticeable through its absence, but here's where most people misunderstand it. They think reflection automatically leads to return. It doesn't. Reflection only leads to clarity, and clarity can go in any direction. Sometimes it brings understanding of value, other times it brings acceptance of distance. What actually changes is not the other person's emotions on command, but their perception of what your presence meant in their emotional landscape. There is also a philosophical layer to this. Human attachment is often not built in the moment of presence, but in the moment of absence. We define value not only by what we have, but by what we fear losing or struggle to access. When something becomes slightly out of reach, the mind assigns it weight. Not because it has changed, but because perception has shifted. Distance creates contrast, and contrast creates evaluation. At the same time, pulling away reveals something about you as well. It removes emotional noise from your own identity. You are no longer constantly reacting, explaining, or overinvesting. You step back into observation rather than pursuit. And that shift alone changes the entire dynamic, because now, instead of being emotionally entangled in uncertainty, you are grounded in restraint. And restraint communicates something powerful without words, that your presence is not dependent on reaction. But the key truth here is subtle. If reflection leads her back, it is not because she was forced by absence. It is because absence revealed meaning that was previously ignored. And if she doesn't return, that reflection still served its purpose. It clarified reality instead of illusion. So, pulling away is not a strategy to control outcomes. It is a psychological mirror. It shows what remains when attention is removed and what was only sustained by constant access. And in that silence, people don't just miss you, they finally understand what they were actually experiencing. Because sometimes distance doesn't change feelings, it reveals them. And once something is revealed clearly, it can never be unseen again. When people talk about pulling away, they often reduce it to a tactic, something you do to get a reaction. But in reality, what actually changes the dynamic is not the absence itself, but the shift in your emotional state while you're absent. Because when you stop chasing, stop over-explaining, stop over-investing your emotional energy into someone else's response, something subtle but powerful happens. Your entire presence recalibrates. You are no longer emotionally loud. You are no longer constantly available for validation. And that changes how you are experienced, not just how you are seen. Psychologically, human attraction is not only about closeness, it's about emotional balance. When one person is constantly reaching and the other is constantly receiving, the balance collapses. What may start as interest slowly turns into expectation, and expectation over time kills curiosity. The moment someone feels emotionally overaccessible, the mystery of presence disappears. But when you pull away in a grounded way, not out of anger, not out of games, but out of self respect, you begin to project something very different. You project emotional independence, and emotional independence is not distance in the physical sense. It is absence of neediness in the psychological sense. That distinction matters because people are not just responding to your actions, they are responding to your internal state. When you are emotionally dependent, even silence feels heavy, but when you are centered, even silence feels intentional. And intention carries weight. There is also a deeper identity shift that happens here. When you are constantly focused on someone else's response, your identity becomes reactive. Your mood rises and falls based on attention, replies, and validation. But when you pull your energy back, you start rebuilding internal structure. You begin to operate from self, direction rather than emotional reaction, and that shift is immediately perceptible even without words. People often underestimate how sensitive we are to energy, not in a mystical sense, but in behavioral cues. Less urgency in messages, fewer emotional spikes, more stability in tone and presence. These are signals, and the human mind is always reading signals, even subconsciously. So, what draws someone back is not simply absence, but the contrast between who you were when you were overinvested and who you become when you are not. That contrast creates curiosity, it disrupts expectation, it forces a quiet recalibration of perception. Why does this feel different now? But here's the part most people miss. This is not about making yourself more desirable. It is about returning to a version of yourself that is not emotionally outsourced. Because the strongest presence a person can have is not someone who is constantly trying to be felt, but someone who remains steady whether they are noticed or not. And ironically, that is often the version that gets noticed the most, not because it demands attention, but because it no longer depends on it. So, the real shift is never about pulling away from someone else. It is about pulling back into yourself until your presence is no longer shaped by reaction, but by direction. Because once your energy stops chasing, it starts defining the space it enters, and that changes everything without a single word being forced. When we talk about someone coming back, after you pull away, one of the most overlooked forces at play is uncertainty, not love in its romanticized form, not strategy, but the brain's deep discomfort with unresolved emotional tension. Humans are not built to sit comfortably in ambiguity. When something familiar suddenly becomes unclear, the mind doesn't relax, it starts working. This is where attachment patterns quietly surface. Every person carries an internal emotional blueprint shaped by past experiences, expectations, and relational habits. When access to someone changes, when messages slow down, presence fades, emotional availability becomes inconsistent. It doesn't just register as distance, it registers as disruption. And disruption activates internal scanning. What changed? Did I lose this? Do I still have access to this person emotionally? That internal questioning is not always conscious, but it is powerful. The mind begins trying to restore equilibrium. It replays past interactions, searches for meaning in recent shifts, and evaluates whether the connection still holds the same emotional certainty it once did. This is not manipulation. It is cognitive processing under uncertainty. But here's the deeper layer. Uncertainty doesn't automatically create desire. What it often creates is attention, and attention is the first doorway through which emotional re-engagement can happen. When something becomes uncertain, it becomes mentally prioritized. It moves from background status to foreground focus. And what the mind focuses on, it starts to emotionally re examine. However, this process is not one directional. Sometimes uncertainty reveals attachment, other times, it reveals detachment. It can clarify whether someone was emotionally invested or simply comfortable with routine access. That's why pulling away is never a guaranteed emotional trigger. It is a revealing mechanism. It exposes what was stable, what was habitual, and what was truly felt beneath convenience. There is also a philosophical truth embedded in this. Human beings often mistake emotional certainty for emotional depth. But certainty can actually mask absence of reflection. When everything is predictable, the mind stops questioning value. It simply continues. Uncertainty breaks that continuity and forces reevaluation. And in that reevaluation, people confront what they previously ignored, not just about others, but about themselves. In some cases, the return is not driven by longing, but by unresolved cognitive loops. The brain dislikes unfinished emotional narratives. It seeks closure, clarity, or reconnection simply to resolve tension. That is why someone may reappear not because the bond has deepened, but because the mind is still trying to complete the story. But there is an important distinction to understand. You are not the solution to someone else's uncertainty. You are not the resolution to their internal confusion. If someone returns only to stabilize their discomfort, the return is emotional regulation, not necessarily emotional commitment. And this is where clarity becomes power. Because once you understand that uncertainty triggers processing, not guaranteed affection, you stop interpreting every return as destiny or validation. You start seeing it for what it is, a psychological response to disruption. At the same time, your own response matters just as much. If you remain grounded, you are no longer participating in emotional instability. You are observing patterns instead of being pulled by them. And that distance within yourself is what protects you from misreading confusion as connection. So when uncertainty activates attachment patterns, it is not a signal to chase or interpret blindly. It is a signal to observe, to see what is real beneath reaction. Because not every return is a reconnection, and not every absence is a loss. Sometimes uncertainty doesn't bring people back to you. It brings clarity about them to you, and that clarity is far more valuable than any temporary return could ever be. Because in the end, what survives uncertainty is not confusion, it is truth.